Today, we want to talk about this element, number 28 on the periodic table, called nickel. On the left side of nickel, we have cobalt, and on the right, we have copper. But in this video, we want to just talk about nickel. This is nickel. I'm glad I was able to show this. I'll see you in the next video. I'm just joking. The first time somebody actually wrote about nickel was in the year 1751 by a Swedish scientist named Axel Cronstedt. He noticed that this element is a metal and he named it kupfernickel. At that time, he wrote that this metal is not good to use for anything, and you could say it's useless. Back then, most scientists around the world agreed with this statement that it's useless. People thinking nickel is not useful continues for another 100 years, and then we get to year 1857 when the US government started making coins made out of nickel. It's good to know that to this day, the 5-cent coin in the US is called a nickel, even though it's not made from nickel anymore. Either way, the world had not figured out the true potential of nickel, and this is when we get to the end of the 19th century. This is the time where the US and Britain are trying to create a super steel, like a steel that's super strong, so they can use it on their navy destroyers. This is when they realized that when you mix nickel with steel, it makes it stronger, so they started mixing the steel with the nickel and using them on their navy ships, and that made them much stronger against enemy cannons. You could say this was the time that nickel was starting to be respected, and they started finding mines around the world. In the beginning of the 20th century, they found a ginormous nickel mine in Sunbury, Ontario, Canada. This mine was so giant and so plentiful that they named nickel the Canadian element. After that, they found nickel everywhere else, especially Russia, but the biggest mine still belonged to Canada, so the Canadian element name stayed with nickel. Another interesting thing they found in the Sunbury mine in Canada is that most of this nickel came from asteroids, and these asteroids were made from pure nickel. Most asteroids are made from different types of metals, especially iron and nickel, and that's in pure form. In the 1930s, scientists realized that they could mix nickel with a vegetable oil, and they realized when they did that, that would bring the melting point of that oil much higher. Most nickel mines around the world came from asteroid impacts, and just like we said, asteroids are made from iron, siderite, that's basically 48% iron, and of course 5 to 20% nickel. When you take a close look at nickel, it's very similar to iron and cobalt. It's good to know that nickel is a fairly good conductor, and when you touch the surface of it, it's very smooth and silver. We said in the beginning of the video that Axel Cronstedt discovered nickel and he named it kupfernickel, but the question is, where did he get that name from? Throughout his life, Axel studied different types of elements, especially metal, and he knew about 150 years ago before him, around the year 1600, there was a copper mine in Germany where they had a certain metal that would mess up their copper, and that is the reason the Germans called that type of metal kupfernickel, which basically means the demon's copper. And since Axel knew this story, he realized that that was nickel mixed with their copper, and that is the reason he chose the name kupfernickel for this element. But later on, they removed the kupfer and just left nickel. Nickel is not a rare element, and it's good to know that it's the 5th most abundant element in Earth's crust. Scientists are not 100% sure, but they believe that the Earth's core is made up of iron and nickel, but unfortunately they can't properly test it to prove it. Just like most elements, especially metals, that are very common at the bottom of the seas and ocean, the most nickel in Earth's crust is at the bottom of the ocean, but obviously it's not worth it to mine it from the bottom of the seas. If you've seen our video about where gold came from, you'll know that most of the gold on Earth are at the bottom of the seas and ocean, and it's still not worth it to go collect that gold. So in this case, you can just forget about the nickel at the bottom of the ocean. Nickel is a type of metal that's rarely used in pure form. It's usually mixed with other elements and metals to create much stronger bonds. Another cool thing nickel makes up is that when you mix it with steel, you get stainless steel, and it also makes the steel stronger. One of the best things nickel does when it's mixed with other elements and metals is that it makes it less corrosive, so the chances of rusting is much less. It also turns the metal more silver and shinier. It's been a very long time since people mixed nickel with steel, and it's used in different types of armor. It started on Navy ships. It's also used in tanks, and of course, other military weapons. The strong parts of a factory tool is usually made from nickel as well. Another interesting thing nickel makes is something you've probably never heard before. If you've seen our video about nitinol, the metal that never forgets where it came from, you'll know what type of metal you get when you mix nickel and titanium together. When you create nitinol, you create a metal that will go back to its original form every time. And one of the places that nitinol is used in is inside your body when your artery won't stay open, so they put a spring in there. It's good to know that there are only 4 elements in the world that are naturally magnetic. One of those elements is iron, cobalt, gadolinium, and of course nickel. If you want to make aluminum magnetic, you could mix nickel with the aluminum. Nickel is not a toxic element because you can naturally find it in different vegetables, fruits, nuts, and you could also find it in chocolate and wine. But any metal in the world, if there's too much, it could become toxic. But there's no problem if it's a normal amount. People that work with nickel for a long period of time should wear masks. It doesn't really affect you when you touch it through your skin. But if there's debris of nickel in the air and you breathe it in, it could be very toxic for your lungs. In this case, working with nickel for a long time could damage not only your lungs, but your entire body. In Egypt, there are different nickel mines, and they realized in 2012 that a lot of the employees had kidney problems. And then they realized that too much nickel got in their system and it damaged their kidney. Let's see how much nickel is. Right now, since I'm recording this video, nickel is about $27.04 per kilo. And just like the stock exchange, it goes up and down all the time. Like in March 2022, it skyrocketed to about $48 per kilo. So how many kilos of nickel do you need? I can wrap it up for you.